what I'm saying, my thesis, if you like, is consistent with Thomas Piketty. And that is, with growth, we actually have not seen diminishing levels of inequality. That in fact, on the contrary, they've been rising in tandem with growth.
So I don't disagree with you. Of course, there are areas where there are changes happening, where people moving around, moving to Alexandra, for example, increasing the population, increasing the size of the squatter camp, maybe even increasing poverty over there. And that's a developmental question, and we can talk about that. But to say that we have, as a rule, an increase in poverty globally, an increase in hardship globally, that just isn't true.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're going to have a little chat on the influence of GDP, economic growth, and if the way it is calculated is potentially flawed. We have with us Dawie Roodt, who is the chief economist at the Efficient Group, and Malcolm Ray, who is the author of the book, The Tyranny of Growth: Why Capitalism Has Triumphed in the West and Failed in Africa. So gentlemen, welcome. Dawie, it's so good to see you back on South African soil. Can you perhaps give our viewers an update on your situation? Because I think a lot of people might be worried still that you're not okay. So can you give us an update of your situation?
Thank you, Donald, and hi, Malcolm. Nice sharing this platform with you. Okay, I think you're referring to our Russian trip. We went to Russia for a family affair. I'm married to a Russian girl, and on our way back, they refused our kids to leave Russia without Russian passports because they're Russian citizens. They've got dual citizenship. It's a technical thing, but we ended up in an airport without any money because my credit cards don't work there because Russia is being sanctioned via the SWIFT system. They've been cut off from the SWIFT system. So I end up without money, without a place to stay, with a semi-hysterical wife and 2 crying kids. So that's not a nice situation to be in. Fortunately, we know people and they assisted us and they brought us some money. And eventually, after a few days, it was unfortunately, there were holidays then, official holidays in Russia. But eventually we found out where to go to and we filled in the necessary forms. And literally within hours, we got the passports for the kids and we could leave Russia. So that was a bit of an experience and it was a bit of an adventure, I guess. But it's not nice to sit at an airport without any money. And that really was the thing that really got me down. I learned a lot in my trip in Russia, the way that they see the war, the way that this war and sanctions are affecting their economy and so on. And I'm planning to write something about that. And I'll make sure you get it as well, Malcolm.
I'd be very interested in reading that.
So Dawie, would this be perhaps an example of where sanctions actually damage the average person more than the intended recipients?
Well, looking at the Russian economy, we were at this city actually called Sochi. That's where the previous Winter Olympics were held. And we were in Moscow as well. So we spent a couple of days in both those 2 cities. And I couldn't see any economic hardship whatsoever. Everybody is talking about business and how well business are going. In the case of Sochi, they're preparing for the holiday season. It's the beginning of the holiday season now. And since many Russians are not or cannot go to other countries that easily anymore, they go to Sochi, which is a very popular local holiday destination. So I couldn't see anything. Of course, you get the odd beggar here and there, but it's always been like that. In fact, my experience from Russia that I saw 2 weeks ago, or a week ago actually, is of a Russia that really came a long way since I visited Russia before, and that's about 2 or 3 years or so ago. So Russia, from an economic point of view, I simply cannot see any hardships. In fact, I've spoken to some Russians that are involved in exports and imports and money business, and they are starting to make plans to circumvent the sanctions, and some of them already started, in fact. In fact, we know that the Russians and the Chinese have already established their own payment system. So the SWIFT system will certainly hurt them, and the sanctions certainly will hurt the Russians, but it's only a matter of time when they will make a plan to get around that.
Malcolm, do you have an opinion on the Russian conflict?
No, look, I don't want to comment on that. I do have an opinion, obviously, but it isn't something that I've been giving it a great deal of thought to. I agree with Dawie. I think in terms of making a plan, payment systems and so on, certainly, and notwithstanding all of that, both China and Russia have been for quite some time now circumventing the official NATO kind of architecture.
Mm-hmm.
China with the Silk Route and so on. I think you're going to see an entirely new dynamic playing out globally in the coming years, it's not necessarily the current conflict that would have triggered it. I think these are initiatives that have been underway for quite some time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I certainly agree with Dawie there, and I think technology is a massive disruptor. So whatever was safe and secure for the West historically is no longer the case today.
Hello, everyone. If you're interested in advertising on WorldView, drop us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com. We will send you an advertisement guide, which will include the rates and the process involved. A typical shout out for your company or project will be between 45 and 60 seconds. By advertising on our platform, you'll be supporting a company that wants to improve the public narrative. Once again, send us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com, which you can also find in the description below. Now, back to the interview.
Yeah.
So, Dawie, perhaps on that note, you say that Russia has improved dramatically since you were last there. Can you perhaps give us your viewpoint on GDP and economic growth? Isn't this perhaps an example of where GDP is not reflecting accurately the growth that Russia has experienced over the past few years?
I don't think necessarily, but let me give you my view and why I say I think economic growth is stronger and the economy worldwide is actually bigger. Maybe I could just make a comment. The first time I went to Russia was approximately 25 years or so ago. And then people were selling stuff on the streets just to survive. It was a completely different place to what I've just visited a week or so ago. So Russia came a very, very, very long way the past 20 years or so. All right, let's have a look at the economy, and let me tell you why I say and why I think the economy is actually bigger than what we think. Maybe it's important to understand that economies go through phases of development. And when we talk, and maybe the first point I should make, it is impossible to calculate the size of the economy. We just don't know what the size of the economy is, and economists don't even agree amongst each other on what should be included in the economy. And there are many, many examples of that. So, for example, if the neighbor's son breaks my window and I replaces the window, then that is added to economic growth, the fact that I replaced it, but the fact that the window was broken in the first instance is not subtracted from economic growth. So that's one example. Another one is if I make use of certain services, then that's actually part of economic activities. But if I marry that woman, then it's not part of economic activities. That's another example. So there are many examples like this. So we don't know how to measure the economy. We've got a sort of an idea, and there's a more or less a consensus, but there's a lot of uncertainty on what the economy actually is. Secondly, if you stand back a little bit and you see how economies evolved over time, it started off with the primary production, the dirty industries, agriculture and mining. And then gradually, once you've established that, you will add value in your secondary sectors and manufacturing as an example. And then once you've established that, value add will move to the tertiary sectors where you produce wool in the primary sector, you knit the jersey in the secondary sector, and you sell the jersey in the tertiary sector. That's typically how economies evolved. And if you analyze economic activities today, you will find that most advanced economies, most economic activities are taking place in the tertiary, the advanced sectors, including things like, for example, agriculture and mining, and the original primary sector businesses to an extent are actually find themselves pretty much in the tertiary industries today. Like, for example, genetic engineering. That is pretty much an agricultural kind of thing, but it's actually a service industry activity. But the point I want to make, so most economic activities happens today in the tertiary sectors, and most economic growth is happening in the tertiary sectors. And that's a service industries typically, and it's also the industries that's where technology plays a major role, like things can be digitizable things, if there's such a word. Now, let me give you one or two examples on why I think the economy is we simply do not report all the economic activities. I read the report. This is just one example. I read the report on the value of Googling, and this specific article calculated that the value of Googling is $600 per annum per individual in the United States. But it's free to Google. We can go and we can Google as much as we like, provided you've got an internet connection. It doesn't cost you anything. If you have a free Wi-Fi connection, for example. So you can Google for free, but there's a value to that, but it's not added to any economic activity. So that's one example. Another example, I think I've shared that with you, is where I decide to make use of Uber instead of renting a car like I usually would have done. Nowadays, when I go down to Cape Town, I usually Uber. And the cost saving to the economy is immense. Some businesses, of course, the renting business doesn't like that. They're losing money. But Uber is saving a lot, and my business is saving a lot because we're saving time and all that. But that is also not properly captured in economic activity. There's a second example, and many other examples. And I also believe that people get involved in businesses like what you are doing, probably. And your activity, your business, is not properly captured in official economic data. So there are a couple of examples of why I think that the economy is actually bigger. Perhaps the last comment that I can make. If you look, there are many ways of looking at an economy. We look at GDP growth, we look at inflation and interest rates and that sort of stuff. But I would say the single most important economic data out there is life expectancy, because everything comes together in life expectancy, and life expectancy correlates well with everything else, with levels of education, of income, of safety, or health services. Everything correlates with life expectancy. And worldwide, we've seen a dramatic increase in life expectancy in poor countries and rich countries all over the place. And that also tells me that there's more to the economy than what we officially are reporting, and things are actually doing much better than what we think they are.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I've wondered, I know American company YouTube pays our channel, but how does that factor into South Africa's economic growth? Because obviously the money is used there. But yeah, Malcolm, so if isn't there a flip side to this coin? Isn't there perhaps some economic activity that's not being reported that's actually an indication of we're not growing as fast as we can? Perhaps you can give us your point of view that GDP might be flawed the other way around.
Not necessarily a flip side. It might be a semantic flip, but it's not a flip side. I mean, I agree with Dawie on one level that we're not calculating a lot of economic activity, and what Dawie has missed is the informal sector, for example. I mean, 80% of the African continent is informal.
Yeah.
This is latest data. 80%. So I mean, we're not talking about just under 50. It's a sizable number. In other words, 80% of the continent survives within a sector of the economy that isn't quantified. And I mean, if you think about people like Ananda de Soto and his theory of dead capital, what he essentially is saying is that if you don't have something on a national register, then you're not going to be able to measure it or quantify it. And that's the reality in the informal economy. So in other words, I'm not saying that 80% of, or rather 100% of the 80% of the economy in Africa is not quantified, right? Some of it is because there's seepage from the informal sector into the formal sector through casual labor and so on and so forth, right? And also through the production of goods that find themselves in consumer markets within the formal sector that eventually get quantified. But what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that the problem is actually bigger than what Dawie is saying it is. It's far more sizable, certainly in developing economies, where significant chunks of economies are outside of the formal metric, that we use to calculate what we call growth. But let me just say this in response to Dawie. I think the perspective from which I come at this is the question of whether the current framing of the growth model. Okay, I mean, we all accept that since the 1940s, gross domestic product has been the measure that we use to determine success or failure of economies. Now, it may not be accurate in terms of what gets included in it. And certainly, Dawie, you're right. I mean, what gets included in it now, today, in an age of digital economy, I agree that we underestimate. So, there's no flip side to the coin in that respect. I agree with Dawie that we're undercounting growth, rather than overestimating it. So there's no disagreement there, there's a lot that, and I was going on to say that, in relation to the digital economy, the emerging digital economy and intangibles, there's a lot more there that is not accounted for. And I think there's a policy lag globally between the kind of operating reality on the one side and policies that no longer fit or aren't fit for purpose, and I think we haven't played catch up in that respect. And I'm not entirely convinced that anything I've read makes sense from a policy point of view in terms of actually calculating the value of the digital economy. So sure, but I think my issue is actually the question as I was saying, of the traditional framing and the current framing of the growth model, which I think has to change, and that's where I'm coming from. I mean, I think the role of growth has been framed too narrowly by material aims, it's almost being kind of hollowed out by a misguided vision of unbounded consumer freedoms. That's my issue with the post 1940s growth doctrine and GDP as its measure. It's less about whether we're undercounting or overestimating the value of national economies, and more about what we're, in theory, measuring. Measuring what we use in order to measure success and failure is what I find problematic in relation to this. Now, I mean, if you think about growth, okay, every let's assume 4 or 5 years that governments get elected, you have a new government coming in, and you have new policies sometimes not, but often you have new policies. All of these policies may differ, over time, but they generally tend to converge in a modern capitalist country anyway. They tend to converge on a single thing, and that is growth and how to get it right. So you may have differences between the various policy architectures, but generally the goal is really how to increase the rate of growth and level of growth. Notwithstanding the policy nuances, the thing that we need to ask ourselves year in and year out is that we tend to get the same results. You may have high growth at some stage, you may have subpar growth at another stage, but the net effect is always the same. Growth rises in tandem with inequality. And I mean, the thing is, I agree with Thomas Piketty in that massive tome of his, in which he did a long-range assessment of inequality over time. And what it's shown is that inequality, contrary to Simon Kuznets' curve, has actually increased with growth, over time. Right? And we need to ask ourselves, why is that the case? I mean, why are we chasing growth as a goal and a measure of success, right, when it produces the same results year in and year out?
Okay, I think we should quickly bring in Dawie. Dawie, what is your opinion of...
Malcolm, I hear what you say, and I mean, you're right in the sense that the policies remain more or less, well, not completely right, because there's a gradual drift in policies over time, and we can talk about that. But generally speaking, you're right. The governments try to chase economic growth, and they more or less achieve that. And you mentioned inequality, and we could talk about inequality if you want to. But the reality also is that even with the flawed way that we use, or the flawed instruments that we use to measure the size of the economy, even that correlates with everything that is good. So if we can keep on chasing economic growth, the conventional economic growth, the flawed way that we're measuring economic growth, that will lead eventually to an increase in unemployment, or rather to an increase in living standards, a reduction in unemployment, a reduction in poverty, and that sort of stuff. Because that's what's been happening for how many years? And I agree, we all agree that the way that we measure things are wrong. But keep on doing this, and you will see more of the same. And more of the same is more good things. We've never had it this good. Of course, there are now and again, there's a bit of a blip in the data, like what we saw the last 2 years or so because of the lockdown, not because of the virus. I think governments handled this completely incorrectly. But apart from the past 2 years or so, just about every year, we have seen per capita GDP going up, living standards going up. Everything is going up, even wars. We're even fighting each other less than in the past. Of course, the past 3 months is not a good measure. But over time, things are generally getting better. If this is a debate about inequality, then there are a couple of things about inequality in South Africa that I would like to mention. But the point I want to make is, maybe you are right that we should be measuring it differently, and let's talk about that and write some economic or theoretical articles about that. But what we've been doing the past since 1940, so just after the Second World War, mostly worked out to the benefits of most people on this planet.
So Malcolm, has everything been good since the Second World War? Has things been improving, like Dawie said?
No, certainly not. And I mean, I think what we're excluding here is the, we're sort of disarticulating the success of say the United States, where, by the way, I mean, there's a problem. I mean, there's a disconnect between growth and its distributional dividends. But we need to look at these countries, these so-called success stories in relation to developing economies or regions of the world, like the African continent. I mean, I've said this before on many occasions, and I've traced it historically in my book, and that in one sense, the African continent and similar developing regions are giant pools of externalities. I just started out talking about the fact that 80% of the African economy is informal. I mean, that should tell you something. So when we speak of per capita, we're actually excluding 80% of people who don't fall within that measure of per capita income. They aren't included. They're essentially part of the externalities and part of the problem of the way in which we measure growth. But that aside, I think that when we actually take a step back and we ask ourselves another question, I think that's very important in relation to the perception that things are getting better and that there's more prosperity and so on. We need to look at that in the context not just of distribution, but of finite resources. In a world where you have 9 billion plus people now who all aspire to, let's assume that all these people aspire to the same level of affluence achieved in OECD nations, just for argument's sake, right? And such an economy, by some calculations, would need to be 15 times the size of this one by the year 2050. I mean, that's just some recent data, and 40 times bigger by the end of the century. Now, you chase growth for great sake, without considering its distributional effects and the context in which it's produced. And you've got to ask yourself whether a system like this is actually sustainable. I've said this to you before, Donald, that I don't have a problem with growth per se. I think growth is necessary. Without it, economies collapse, right? But I do have a problem with the kind of organizing framework of the current growth model, and of course its goals, its priorities, and ultimately its measures. I think that's the issue here. And on a practical level, it really is a matter of starting to kind of consider the facts that no matter what your take on prosperity is, whether it's inclusive or not so inclusive, at the end of the day, the question needs to be asked whether it's sustainable. My answer to that question is that it's not.
On that note, Dawie, is it sustainable? I mean, for example, another example would probably climate change. If the economy is growing too fast, some would argue that leads to climate change. Yep, Dawie, you're muted.
The real problem is, I really don't understand. Is inequality the problem that he's pointing out here? Is it environmental issues that he's pointing out here? If it is about inequality, then we can talk about inequality. If it is about environmental issues, we can do that as well.
Perhaps we should talk about inequality, I think.
Let's talk about inequality then. Well, I can tell you it could be true that we could see, and again, these sort of things are measured in a certain manner, and it's not necessarily right. Since we don't even know what the size of the economy is, we can't really measure the size of inequality. But okay, having said that, it's very clear that there are some people in the world that are immensely wealthy, and many people in the world that are very, very, very poor. But even the poor and even the very poor, in fact, I think it's 2 years ago that the Chinese reached this amazing their goal that they set themselves out to reach, and that is to get rid of absolute poverty. There is no more absolute poverty in China. So there could be an increase in inequality, but I would argue, but so what? Because we don't have people living in absolute poverty anymore. Anyway, if you're poor today, I can tell you, if I'm poor and I have a choice, I would certainly want to be poor in a rich country, and certainly don't want to be poor in a poor country, as an example. In the case of South Africa, if we talk about inequality, the biggest driver for inequality in South Africa is unemployment. And if you can only get people employed in one way or the other, and again, but the best answer to that is economic growth, then that will have a huge impact on inequality. So I don't understand what this thing is about inequality. A very good example in the case of South Africa, apart from unemployment, all we need to do, we have to pay the civil servants in South Africa what they are worth, which is much less than what they're currently getting, generally speaking. And that in itself will reduce inequality. Getting rid of 1 or 2 billionaires is not going to change inequality in South Africa. Or anywhere in the world for that matter. There are many other bigger forces driving inequality, like, for example, unemployment in the case of South Africa. So I don't understand really what this debate is about. Let me give you an environmental argument. A calculation that I have done. Now, we know that the ANC government destroyed South Africa and just about everything that they've touched. It is the most destructive force this economy has ever seen. This government, it is a criminal organization masquerading as a government, nothing else than that. And we can see that in the collapse of Eskom. Eskom has been running to the ground operationally and financially. But because we do not have electricity in South Africa, our electricity productivity increased by more than 20%. That's one example how we're actually making better use of electricity. And there are many other examples as well. So yes, there's still environmental issues. There are still poor people. There's still inequality in the world. But the general direction of everything is moving in the right direction.
Yeah. So go ahead, Malcolm.
I disagree. And again, I mean, you can argue, we can pick arguments about whether we have a sense of what the economy is, whether we can actually come close to valuing the economy in real terms. And I've got no problem with that. But the point is, the data in evidence and some work that is now being done in the informal economy for the first time in a very serious way by a bunch of developmental economists is beginning to suggest at least something of what the picture is what the contours of the picture should look like. And the problem I've got here is that there is, along with growth, rising concentrations of wealth. And I mean, whether you dispute the data coming out officially from the IMF, the World Bank, and even the WEF and Oxfam, for that matter, which sits on the other side. Even if you dispute that, the overwhelming evidence suggests that there's rising concentrations of wealth, among individuals, and that's part of the concern about inequality. For the most part, we avoid the stark reality of these numbers. I mean, the default assumption is that crises aside, growth will continue indefinitely and that things are getting better. You can raise China as an example and so on and so forth. The growth has delivered the bottom line. It's since the Second World War has delivered its benefits at best unequally. I mean, we can't move away from that. A fifth of the world's population, you can dispute that statistic. You know, there's a margin of error always. But a fifth of the world's population earns just 2% of global income. You know, inequality is higher in OECD nations than it was 20 years ago. You know, and while the rich got richer, let me finish. Middle-class incomes in Western countries were stagnant in real terms long before, you know, we hit recession. And certainly long before 2007, you know, when the global financial crisis hit us. I mean, far from raising the living standard for those who, you know, most need it, growth, you know, has let, I would argue, much of the global population down. You know, wealth has actually trickled up rather than trickled down. And I mean, the kind of logic of much of the policy articulations around the growth narrative has been that if you have more growth, it trickles down. And that was partly, you know, the logic of the pre-19, well, you know, some of the arguments prior to the introduction of Simon Kuznets' curve. You know, we look, the point is, at the end of the day, we can quibble about whether the data is accurate, you know, or whether it comes close to anything like accuracy. But the reality that we see around us is a world in which growth has a tendency, or is corresponding increasingly with not prosperity for all, but rising inequality and rising poverty also, you know, in the least developed regions of the world.
No,
and I think there's a collective blindness, you know, in a sense that we need to get out of, that kind of collective blindness, which is what is problematic for me, anyway.
No, we don't disagree on the numbers being a little bit fuzzy here and there, and I'm not disagreeing with you on that. And I may even agree with you that there could be an increase in inequality in certain instances globally, and a concentration of the wealth, as you mentioned that. But that doesn't mean that the poor are not better off. The poor today are much, much, much better off than just only a few years ago. Of course, it's not a straight line thing. Sometimes you get an Elon Musk and he becomes immensely wealthy because of some new introduction or new technology or whatever, Facebook guys or Microsoft, Bill Gates or whatever, because of new technology that they bring to the world, and they capitalize on that. But nobody's worse off because of that. They are much, much better off. Everybody else is better off. They are only much better off than the average guy out there, but everybody is better off. The gap between the haves and the have-nots may have increased, but even the poor benefited from Microsoft, as an example. So no, I simply cannot agree with you on that. Is that saying there's an increase in poverty? Of course you get increases in poverty now and again, but those instances are usually man-made. It is because of political instability or wars or whatever the case may be. In fact, the world has never seen a shortage of food. Never, ever. We've had some issues with logistics, yes, but we've never seen a shortage of food, and food has become more and more abundant. Even the poor today, very poor people, can get access to things like antibiotics, something that the wealthiest people in the world 100 years ago couldn't get access to. So everybody, without a doubt, is better off. And of course, like I've said, it's not a straight line thing. And I don't care about inequality as long as the poor are getting better off, and the poor are much better off today than only a few years ago.
I disagree with that, and the point is, you know, in recent months, I've been doing a lot of empirical work in some communities in South Africa, including Alexandra. And Alexandra, because I've been visiting the township for quite a number of years now, you know, in a research capacity. And the last time before the most recent visits to Alexandra that I visited the place to do work, to do research, was in the first decade of the 2000s. And I can tell you that I was shocked. You know, newspapers, media in this country are lazy. The Alexandra that I saw in recent months was nothing like the Alexandra that I had seen a couple decades ago. I mean, the evidence was everywhere, but in the numbers. Was everywhere, but in the numbers. Firstly, the place had quite visibly grown in size. And I'm talking about a growth in poverty here, and in some cases, absolute poverty. You had parts of Alexandra along London Road, when I last visited, were essentially factories. These are brick and mortar buildings. Today, it's massive squatter camps on top of squatter camps on top of squatter camps. So there's a lot of in-crowding because people are desperate. And we're talking about people from South Africa and other parts of the African continent because people are desperate. Alexandra is very close to Sandton. It's very close to everything around us in Johannesburg. And essentially what I've witnessed, which has never been reported before, is that the boundary or the invisible boundary of Alexandra, which was roughly Alexandra, London Road, bordering Marlborough, that boundary is being pushed out. It's actually being pushed out. So what was essentially a kind of buffer area where factories set up shop in the past. You had quick access to labor, casual labor in the main, and so on in the township. That's now been gobbled up essentially by squatters, and it's now been pushed out substantially, by about a kilometer, in fact, toward Marlborough. The township, in other words, is exploding, and it's exploding under the impact of poverty. Now, this is just but one example of other areas that I have been revisiting, like Diepkloof, for example. And I'm talking about townships in the Johannesburg area because my study focuses on the Johannesburg area. That's its location. The evidence is there, that things are getting worse. So, you might argue that things in certain parts of the world are getting better, but I don't see that, in the evidence, in places like, or just single cities like Johannesburg, where, and by the way, these individuals, I said before, these individuals are not accounted for in calculations or, in per capita income. So one can use that kind of data, but the reality is that it's of no use in a region like the African continent. Once again, where 80% of people survive or barely survive in the informal sector.
Dawie?
Yeah, in fact, Malcolm, I can agree with what you've just said about Johannesburg as an example, and I think there are many other examples, especially in South Africa. And in fact, the official data also shows that we have rising levels of absolute poverty in South Africa. Yes, and the reasons are well known to that. It has to do mostly with the government that we have, but it also has to do with factors like, for example, a huge influx of foreigners, especially from poorer countries in Africa coming to South Africa, leading to this increase in squatter camps and so on. I've compared, and again, these are official numbers, and we're not going to go through the debate about the official numbers, but I've compared South Africa's per capita income or GDP to other countries in Africa, and South Africa today is approximately 2.5 times wealthier on a per capita basis than Sub-Saharan Africa. It used to be much more. We used to be more than 3 times wealthier than the average African or Sub-Saharan African. It's coming down. So the rest of Africa is actually catching up with us. But even in the case of South Africa, we are a little bit better off. Not much, not so much better off than the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, but we are a little bit better off. But maybe I can just, so I don't disagree with you. Of course, there are areas where there are changes happening, where people moving around, moving to Alexandra, for example, increasing the population, increasing the size of the squatter camp, maybe even increasing poverty over there. And that's a developmental question, and we can talk about that. But to say that we have, as a rule, an increase in poverty globally, an increase in hardship globally, that just isn't true. Then maybe just another comment that I can make. I did mention that as far as I'm concerned, the single most important set of economic data is life expectancy. Life expectancy correlates, good life expectancy correlates with everything that is good. But there's another measure that can be used apart from life expectancy as well, and that is population growth. And here's something very interesting that I've noticed, and this is my own research that I've done a couple of years ago. I've noticed when economies are doing well, the life expectancy goes up with that as well. And life expectancy goes up to, life expectancy is usually not higher than about 85 years. So from 80 to 85 years, that seems to be the limit of life expectancy on average at the moment. Of course, it's increasing over time, but that is where life expectancy usually is. And the interesting thing, the moment life expectancy reaches about 80 years, suggesting good economic environment, but once it reaches about 80 years, then population growth goes into negative. That's a very interesting thing that I've picked up. And all over the globe, you find that.
No, we confused. Hello, we're still there.
Expectancy reaches something that 80 years, with one or two exceptions. The two exceptions that I know of, the one is Russia, for example, and another one is China. In the case of China, it's because of their one-child policy, but they would have reached their negative population growth where they're going to get to now, within the next year or so. They would have reached that in any event, only a little bit later, but a one-child policy accelerated this whole process. And the other example is Russia, and part of the reason for Russia is simply because they're drinking too much. But a general rule is that a falling life expectancy, or rather falling population growth, and eventually population growth going into negative, is a sign of a prosperous society. Japan is a good one, Italy is a good one, Germany, all sort of places. And what we've seen in Africa even is that population growth is coming down. It's still very, very high. And it's far too high, perhaps, in the case of Africa. And in the case of South Africa also. South Africa's population growth at the moment is approximately 1.5%, nearly 2% or so, more or less in line with economic growth at the moment, but it is coming down. And that's the point I'm trying to make. And that's another sign of the world, the world population getting better off every year. The two, like I've mentioned, life expectancy and falling population growth.
I think we're confusing things here. I think you know, I started out saying I don't have a problem with growth. I said that when growth falters, economies go into a panic mode, and you've got trouble. That's not what I'm disputing. What I'm saying, my thesis, if you like, is consistent with Thomas Piketty, and that is, with growth we actually have not seen diminishing levels of inequality. That in fact, on the contrary, they've been rising in tandem with growth. Now, my issue here is not necessarily single economies, but the distribution of growth across regions in the world and the kind of historical context in which this pattern has emerged. And I'm speaking here specifically about least developed countries or economies and underdeveloped countries. Economies. I would argue that the notion of population growth on the one side and then life expectancy, that those things don't apply to the 80% of people in the African continent who survive in the informal economy in immiserized conditions. They certainly don't. They don't apply to people living in Alexandra Township. You know, whether they're African, people from the African continent or people from South Africa is irrelevant over here. The bottom line is that per capita income isn't something that is applicable, and life expectancy as a measure isn't something that is applicable to vast swathes of humanity who survive in these developed economies, and certainly in the informal economies of developing countries. That's my problem, you know. The thing about growth as a goal, you know, in principle, is not something that I'm disputing. In fact, I'm an advocate of it. You know, I think that growth is necessary. For if not growth, then what? You know, unless you convince me otherwise, it's a thesis that I still embrace. It's a matter of growth for whom? You know, and whether the kind of patterned effect of it over the past 80+ years is something that is palatable. I mean, you know, we all seem to be in pursuit of growth. We all, a hell of a lot of economists, the neoclassical economists in particular, you know, seem to hold the sort of fundamental thesis of Adam Smith in high regard, that the pursuit of self-interest generates growth, and in the process we pursue the general good. But I've always argued that nothing could be more fallacious than that. That the narrow pursuit of growth represents a horrible distortion of the common good and underlying human values. And I think we've seen this over the past 80 plus years manifest in the kind of disarticulation of the benefits of growth within developing regions of the world. The disarticulation of that from the beneficiaries that sit principally in the West, and now emerging in the East as well, in places like China. And we know why China, by the way, is growing. We know why there's such massive antipathy in various parts of the African continent and other developing regions in the world about China. So we can't look at China and its success story in isolation from its impact on other developing economies in the world. I've got a massive problem with the Chinese model of growth, in the same way that I've got a huge problem with the Russian model of growth, and equally with, and if not more, with the Western, with the American centered and the OECD model of growth. Yeah. So let me just come back and summarize. I don't have a problem with growth at all. I am an advocate of it. And in some senses, I do embrace some of the arguments that come from some of the degrowth economists, not all of them. I've got a problem with some of the arguments that they put. But in principle, let's agree. The thing that both of us agree with is that growth is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, okay? It's turning a blind eye to the stuff that I think ought to matter and the stuff that's been jettisoned, emptied out of the technical measures and goals and priorities that we often set around policy that I've got a problem with.
So, Malcolm, maybe I can just also mention, Scandinavian countries had a look at some of the economic growth numbers the past, say, 80 years or so. And Scandinavian countries are very, very wealthy countries today. And they were very, very poor countries 80 years ago. And many other examples. So China is a very good example. But, another hopeless continent or subcontinent certainly was until not too long ago, that of India. And they still have very, very high levels of poverty in India, but the Indian economy just overtaken, and inequality. But in terms of size, the Indian economy just overtaken the UK. So it is in an even bigger economy, the UK.
That doesn't matter.
And of all the big economies, the Indian economy is going to grow the fastest this year. And I can tell you, we are going to see a dramatic fall in poverty in India as well. But again, I'm trying to figure out what your concerns are. I
think it's inequality.
Yeah, inequality. But then my question to you is:
I've said that I support Thomas Piketty's book. I think that it's spot on.
So your solution to your problem is to tax wealthy people more, I would guess.
No, hang on. That's another conversation, and we're running out of time here. I mean, we should actually, Donald, I think you set up another conversation, because that's an important question. That's a really important question, and we can't deal with it in a couple of minutes. I don't think, to answer your question, no. I know that Piketty is now evolved into that kind of thinking, and he's saying tax the wealthy, and I've been following his thinking in recent times as well. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I think that's a hell of an important conversation we ought to be having, actually. In itself, I think it's a conversation that we should be having in itself.
But to bring it back quickly, I think your problem is inequality. I think that was what Dawie Roodt was alluding to. Yeah. My problem is inequality and poverty. So, for example, we can argue that India has been powering ahead, and so too China. We could also argue that at various points in time, a country like Ghana, with which I'm very, very familiar, I've visited very many times, has clocked 10% GDP growth. But against in real terms, GDP growth for whom? You step into Accra and you step into essentially an impoverished Dust Bowl. So what does 10% mean in real terms? When we speak about per capita income in a place like Ghana, what does that mean in real terms? What are we measuring? When we come up with these numbers,
That's the problem that I have. You know, we often the cop out in Africa is we often say that it's 10% of a low base. But again, what does that mean? You know, I think we need to be confronting these things, and we need to be entertaining the idea that actually there are different lenses through which we can interpret data, as limited as it is, data. And I mean, Dawie, I think what's very important, to come back to your introduction to this conversation, is the data that we're calculating. I agree entirely with you. You know, that we don't have a cooking clue. You know, and it's very important to actually, you know, to get to a point where we have more accurate data at our disposal, and that includes fundamentally in the African context, the informal sector. You know, it's no longer excusable to argue that it's hard to calculate data in the informal sector because it's unregistered. You know, it's no longer an excuse given the size of the sector in the African continent. And so I think it's very important that that the data that we start gathering corresponds more accurately with real lived realities, you know, of people, of communities, of societies, of economies.
Malcolm, we can always improve on the data, and of course, as economists, we should always try to see what we can do to improve on the data and to have better insights and to get more sources of data and to try to understand the data better. And we will never reach that point where we will have all this information. That's why it's such an amazing job to be an economist, because there is always something that can be bettered, something that you can improve on. But even a poor country like Ghana, if they keep on growing at 10%, and they keep on doing it for a number of years, they will get better off. Even the poorest of the poor will be better off. That's because that has been what's been happening globally. It will not be a straight line thing. Some people will be much better off than others. But I am judging from what we've seen from history, if poor countries keeps on growing, even at the flawed way that we measure things, if they keep on doing that, eventually the poor will become much better off as well.
Yeah, well, gentlemen, I see we're running out of time. This has been very interesting. Perhaps we can do something else in the future, perhaps with a more focus on the way we can address this. Like what are some economic indicators? I know Dawie has mentioned a few, but what are some other indicators? How can we improve it? Perhaps that debate on taxes. Should we tax more? But yeah, thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. This has been very interesting. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, you certainly enjoy this content. Please consider liking this video, sharing this widely as possible, subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.